Turn to Genesis chapter 1. We're going to be looking into the specific days of creation. I recall last week I talked a moment about how that it's God's speaking and calling into existence both his creation and humanity, that some people call it God's covenant call. That God has a relationship with his creation. He cares for his creation and specifically cares for people. And because of that, when you think of how central covenant is, both in the Old and New Testament, let me ask you this, because I used to do this when young couples would come into my office for premarital counseling. They wanted to get married. I said, well, you realize that you are agreeing to a marriage covenant. Now, tell me what's the difference between a covenant and a contract. So what's the difference between a covenant and a contract? Covenant has to do with sustaining of relationships, whereas contract typically is based on agreement that has financial concerns at its center. And like Larry said, it's so funny. Remember how people used to say that your handshake was as good as your word and it was a contract, verbal contract? Well, we live in a society that don't believe in verbal contracts anymore. You have to sign a contract. But even then, as Larry said, a lot of people look for ways and will hire lawyers to get out of contracts. Now, unfortunately, people hire lawyers to get out of marriage covenants. But a covenant, a contract, that's the same thing. So when we think about the significance of covenant, God is in relationship with his creation, and he cares about his creation. And because this topic of covenant is so central to everything that happens in the Old and New Testament, it helps you understand that the Bible's not just history. And we need to know that. You're not just opening up a Bible full of history. There's been a term that's been used for several years, and I really like it because it gets at the core of what covenant is. Really, the Bible's not history, it's salvation history. God working through history to save humanity and bring about his purposes. So that's salvation history rooted in covenant. And we talked last week, 3 essential dimensions related to covenant. When God speaks of covenant, there's promises. There are promises rooted in the covenant. Also, there are all different kinds of stories related to the covenant that are designed to help build faith in God. Israel, think of all the story, and we're going to come across several in the book of Genesis that become their identity. Also, this covenant in Genesis, we understand the dimensions of it and what the covenant involves through these stories. And so there's a reason. See, here's the interesting thing. Have you ever thought about this? What if from the beginning of creation till Genesis 50, when you got the story of Joseph understanding what God did for his purposes, and Joseph told his brothers in chapter 50, you meant it for evil, but I know what God was up to now. Well, what if Genesis was filled with everything that happened between creation and Joseph? It's like John says, I don't believe the world could contain the books. So then you step back a moment and say, oh, okay, so God's purposes guide the stories that are included in Genesis. And that helps us because what it makes us do is say, okay, what's the purpose of this story? How does it further the storyline of salvation history? What is God up to, and what does humanity need from God? So we'll be looking at that as we go through the stories. Let's see. Then there's the matter of what's called canonical authority about Genesis. Jews today don't call the Old Testament. They look at it as the Torah for shorthand for all the Old Testament, or they'll call it the Hebrew Scriptures. And the question is, does the Old Testament or the Hebrew Scriptures have any authority for the Christian today? Or, like we mentioned last week, do I just reject the Old Testament and forget it? Because the Old Covenant was done away with, so I don't need the Old Testament. So is my Bible too thick and I only need the New Testament? Well, there is a lot of things we learn about God from the Old Testament, for sure. The New Testament writers were very much immersed in the Old Testament. So much so that the book of Hebrews, the whole book of Hebrews is framed around the Old Testament. If you pulled out all the quotations from the Old Testament out of the book of Hebrews, it wouldn't make any sense. We're not guided by the Ten Commandments per se from the Old, mainly because we realize we don't keep the Sabbath like Israel did. But what's interesting is the rest of the nine, in various ways, are restated in the New Testament. Isn't that interesting? You know what? In 1 Corinthians, Paul picks up on that. He says, you know why Israel was destroyed? Because they grumbled against God. And you think about, whoa, so God doesn't like people to grumble and gripe about, so there's a lot of wonderful lessons that we learn. Now, if we're looking for covenant relationship with God today and what salvation looks like, the Old Testament provides wonderful insight into many of those dimensions, but you have to look at the New Testament for that new covenant that is different from what it was with Israel. Almost as a justification for his quotation from the Old Testament text. Because he's saying, we who are strong ought to bear with the failings of the weak and not to please ourselves. So that's a hard lesson. Each of us should please his neighbor for his good, to build him up. For even Christ did not please himself, but as it is written, the insults of those who insult you have fallen on me. And that's a quote from Psalm 69, verse 9. And then Paul does this. He doesn't just leave the quote like that. He makes this comment. For everything that was written in the past was written to teach us, so that through endurance and the encouragement of the scriptures, we might have hope. Now look at that. The Old Testament functions stories of endurance. People who withstood all kinds of obstacles, conflict, opposition. So stories of endurance in the Old Testament and encouragement from the Old Testament. And that's because scriptures have the power to give us hope. So even as we go through the Old Testament and specifically Genesis, let's look for what Paul says. Are there examples of endurance in the book of Genesis? And can we encourage each other with some of these stories? And certainly we ask the question, is there anything in Genesis that gives us hope? This is really cool for Paul to reflect back on how to use the Old Testament. Isn't that cool? So that we don't have to guess. This is some real specific guidance here. In Romans 1, Paul will address that a little bit. He talks about the divinity or Godhead. And as we know it revealed, that's God the Father, Jesus the Son, and the Holy Spirit. But then he says that the divinity and power of God is known through nature. And in Romans 1, Paul will say something like, so that those who lived outside of Israel, they've not heard the gospel yet, they have no excuse. And so there's something just from natural revelation that we know about God, but certainly not, and what we know now just because of what's in the Old Testament. Think of how God reveals himself an extra step through Jesus that you don't find in the Old Testament. Now, we find God revealing himself in the Old Testament through the burning bush, okay? His presence is in what? The fiery, the tongues of fire and the column of smoke to guide Israel. So as we go in the Old Testament, we see different ways in which God, and in Isaiah, remember, the train of his robe goes through the sanctuary, and Isaiah's like, oh my. So there are little peeks about the nature of God. Jesus reveals to us as much as possible, humanly possible, the fullness of God. In fact, Paul in Colossians will say, the fullness of God dwelt fully in Jesus. So that when Christ came, he revealed so much more about God that we don't know about in the Old Testament. So it's really powerful. But you're right. There are things about God that we would not know in the specificity that we do if we didn't have the Old Testament, for sure. So it's kind of powerful. Well, as we move to the days of creation, let's look at day one. Starts with verse 3. God said, let there be light, and there was light. So in day one, we have light. Let there be light. And he separated the light from the darkness, and God called the light day, identified that as day. God called it day, and the darkness was called, let's put this up here, night. So you have a division between daylight and night. And he says, there was evening and there was morning, and that made the first day. So you have the parameter for each day. Evening and morning comprise this span of time that God identifies as day. Why do you think this is really cool? Think about why do you think that the first act of creation was for God to say, let there be light, and there was light? You see, it connects back in, verse 2, darkness. In the, what's the phrase people use? In the primordial times, you've got the earth was void and empty, darkness over the surface of the deep, over the face of the waters, the face of the deep. And the Spirit of God was hovering over the water. So there's a picture, and I want you to think about this because this is pretty interesting. Think in terms of pre-creation. The picture here is of darkness, chaos, no purpose, all of that. So what happens in creation, out of this dark chaos, God brings order. One of the neat things about creation is that God brings order. And what you're going to see is through this mode of ordering things, God creates the world and sets everything up for his continuing ordering of the stipulations of covenant so that he can have the right kind of relationship he desires for humanity. But this whole thing of ordering the days is fascinating. So he's going to speak first, let there be light, and there was light. Now, some people say, from a scientific perspective, that's where you have the Big Bang Theory. Well, I don't know if there was a bang in this or not. We're not told. We're just not told. You can come up with all the theories you want, but we have two problems. One is we weren't back there and we didn't see it. And number two is if you propose a theory, that's what it is. It's a theory. Means that it could or could not be, and there are other explanations maybe. But isn't it, here's another thing that's fascinating, and I think I had this on my notes to say that so much in the creation narrative is missing that doesn't answer our inquisitive questions. The creation, as it is here, wasn't written to satisfy our curiosity. Because I guarantee you, we all can think of a million questions out of chapters 1 and 2 that are not answered. Well, the creation narrative wasn't given like this. just to satisfy our curiosity. Think of how, as you look at it, the creation as it is portrayed in Genesis 1 and 2 is to lay a foundation for understanding the purposes of God and the power God has to bring about those purposes. Pretty extraordinary. And when you look at that kind of singular purpose, then a lot of the other questions kind of fall away in insignificance because it's not really furthering the purpose of Genesis. You're actually dealing with kind of two different things. One is that quotation about, 1,000 years is like a day for the Lord and whatever. It's a recognition God is not limited by the human perception of time. A very important point that's being made. Here, there are people that want to say that the day is 1,000 years or a long period of time or whatever. Well, here's my response, and I don't want to disfellowship you if you disagree. But here, I think I mentioned this last week. Let's start from the beginning. If God can create the world and bring it into existence and has that kind of power, it certainly doesn't present a conflict for me to believe that he can do what's said in 24 hours here. It's almost like you get the big thing, and then when you start doing days at a time, well, if this God is that big and can do creation to start off with, to me, it doesn't conflict anything in my faith to believe he can do it in 7 days. A guy stumbled onto some unique dinosaur bones on the shore of England. So this one scientist comes on and said, well, this dinosaur lived 150 million years ago. Like, now, how do you know that? First of all, you weren't there that long ago. Secondly, the criteria you use to measure years like that is pretty suspect. And I think we just have to be careful in making out like we know for certainty things that happened in the past when. We don't. God didn't hand us a calendar. If you've done their carbon dating is not as accurate as they make out like it is. There's some issues with it. Think about from a scientific perspective. Do you have your mind made up going into your experiment and research, or are you open to what's out there? And a lot of times, too often, people have their mind made up. Now, the way creation is made is pictured here. It's so cool because Genesis chapter 1 doesn't go into this big, long philosophical argument to prove the existence of God. It just states the existence of God. The God we believe in by faith, you're going to see, this is really neat. This is almost a whole separate lesson. I want you to think about this, because we talked a moment ago about things that we wouldn't know about God if we didn't have the Old Testament. Here's how God reveals himself. First of all, in his deeds and wonders and creative acts. Those tell us something about God. The emotions that God feels. Did you know that in the book of Genesis, God has some pretty strong emotions? And we're going to talk about those when we come up against those. Not only that, but the words that God speaks. What God does in relationship to his creation. All these things begin to form for us the picture of that God wants us to have of who he is. And we embrace that by faith. Evidence for God is think about the design of his creation. And that's a traditional philosophical argument. Somebody has to build a house, and after all, God is the builder of everything. Well, that is a very quick argument to what we call creative design. That design in and of itself. And honestly, we're not surprised with that, because as God goes through these 7 days of creation, you're going to see some logic behind how things are lumped together in the creation, and you're going to see God's design and his purposes begin. What's the guy's name? Several years ago, a guy wrote a commentary just on kind of the whole Old Testament. He's just trying to help you understand the Old Testament. And the title of his book was called God's Designs. So that he talked about creation and he talked about Israel and everything that God did in the Old Testament. You can see God's designs. It was really a neat book. Okay, let's continue on this as we embrace the mystery of God, not knowing all of the answers to all of our questions. So day one, we have the light, and the evening and the morning were the first day. Now, look what happens the second day. Let there be an expanse between the waters to separate water from water. And notice that what you've got here is a separation of the waters. And what would be that separation? What does it become? What does he say in that verse?
Ocean
Yeah, what does it become? The separation.
expands or
So what are the two parts if there's a
the
separation?
sky and the earth.
Well, and because it's waters, what would it be? So you got sky, sea, ocean. So think about this. This is the creation of how the waters begin to interact with the meteorological dynamics that we're aware of today. Think of evaporation, rain. God's creating, separating the waters to prepare it for the kind of interaction between clouds and sea and earth and what that we're used to. Now, why is that an important part of creation? He's laying the foundation for creation to be sustained, and think of how crucial water is for life. So let's think about this. Is light crucial for life? Well, it is. Yeah. Is water crucial for life? Okay. So you're beginning to see how God is orderly pulling this together. Here's another fascinating thing. I don't know if you've thought about this. Could God, I'm going to ask a could God question. Could God have said poof and all 6 days of creation been accomplished in one instant? But he doesn't. Instead, this is God's choice. See, here's another thing I want you to be aware of in Genesis. This is neat. I want you to be aware of those times when it is clear God is making choices. Because when we talk about it in a little bit, we're going to have to wrestle with the idea, what does it mean to be made in the image of God? That's really important in the creation. When God creates Adam and Eve, he made them in the image of God. So one of the things that seems to be really clear to me, he made us human beings in his likeness. One characteristic that is crucial is that of choice. God's a God of choice. God made his creatures of choice. Here's another thing. All of these things that we say about God and how he's created us, they all kind of come together at different places in the whole question of salvation. Is the freedom of choice and our being made in the image of God important in the question of salvation?
Yeah.
It sure is. You can either choose or not choose. And what we're going to find in a little bit when we get to Adam and Eve in the garden, they had to make a choice. They chose wrong, but they had the freedom to choose right. So we've got the water for the second day. God called the expanse sky. He separated the water under the expanse from the water above it. Okay. Now, let's look at day 3. Let the water under the sky be gathered to one place. Let the dry ground appear. And it was so. And so God called that dry land, or it becomes identified as earth. So the dry land appears. Now, is dry land important for existence?
Yeah, because we can't swim all the time.
What if you had nothing but water? Well, we've seen in our lifetime, haven't we, places where water took over the dry land, and I mean, it took everything out. So we're aware of how important the dry land is. To make a move from the observation and it was so. And it was so. But then, as God begins to create, after each of these days of creation, the phrase becomes, it was good. So that we move from an expression of something that happened to now an assessment of what is happening. Now, here's the question, because we're getting close to the end of class time. I want you to wrestle with it this week, and let's start off next week's lesson answering this question. When it moves from the statement, it was so, to it was good, why is there that movement of statement, and what is good? What is that word good supposed to portray? What are we supposed to think about when this observation is made after each day of creation? So I want you to think about that this week. And we're going to come back and talk about it because I think it's crucial. It's crucial in our understanding. And notice what's happened here. It's gone from a statement of fact, and it was so, to a statement of assessment, it was good. Because that's going to be important as we try to answer this. Because a lot of times people will read Genesis 1 and they miss this movement. This is a critical movement, a statement of fact to a statement of assessment. What does it mean for things to be good that God has created? Okay, well, thank you all for being here this morning, and let's pick up at that point next week.